right?
Correct.
And like there's no problem with the peaceful protesters, right? But I feel like the line is kind of being crossed when people are starting to burn down buildings and actually kill people, right? Because like
Yeah.
at the end of the day, like why are you killing those people, right? For example, like those people were not at all involved with George Floyd's death, right? They were not responsible. So why are you sort of bringing them into this mess, right? And like for example, you know, like a black police officer, right?
Mm-hmm.
He was basically shot trying to save someone,
Mm-hmm.
right, from a burning building. I'm pretty sure,
Yeah.
and like all that stuff, and like it's like a mess. It really is. And
Well,
yeah,
the whole jurisdiction behind why the police officers do that in the first place is also emotion. There's a certain
right,
intimidation factor that happens that basically biologically makes the person fear, the police officer fear, and thus protect himself from a danger that doesn't exist because he's in his own head and he doesn't have that mental capability of controlling his emotions. And he pulls the trigger because essentially that's what, the response for fear is. And many times there's so many things written about the incident, about the police officer that shot, another black guy, and many times that excuse is that the person was intimidating, the person was uh, the police officer feared for his life. So there's also an aspect of
right,
fear that involves not just the color of the skin but also the size of the individual, but definitely the color of the skin plays that fear. But
mm,
it gets even deeper than that because psychologically human beings are afraid of the dark. This is a natural form. This is potentially a form of survival as well, where we fear, we avoid, and we continue to survive under certain environments. But there was an instance where they showed psychological sort of test where they showed a bunch of different kids, different dolls. They were basically newborn, almost newborn. They have no experience of the world. They couldn't even speak yet. And they essentially put them in the room and just put a bunch of dolls inside. The black doll was the last one to be picked each time. This was because, again, there is a certain biological bias in the mind. And again, if we consider the mind a passenger, we have to observe that. If we're able to reach the captain of the ship, then we're able to observe the passenger and how he deals with the world around. Now, if you have any sort of third perspective observation on yourself, you ask yourself, why am I afraid of this? Why am I afraid of the color? Why am I afraid of the dark? Why am I afraid of these things? And you would analyze that personally because it's not an answer someone else can give you. It's an answer that you yourself have to you yourself have to find.
right, mm-hmm,
And in the psychological aspect, if people observed their emotions, if they practice meditation to even a minimum extent, just to clear their mind and kind of reset their thoughts, then it could even still provide a form of secondary thought where they can think about what they're thinking. Because when we're always thinking about something, we don't have time to just breathe. We just always think about one thing, another thing. We never think into detail about it. We simply think about it and it affects us. And then we think about the next thing and it affects us. And then we think about the third thing and then it affects us. We don't dispute those thoughts, we just let them go. But with meditation,
right,
you pause yourself from that cycle. And when you restart and start thinking again after meditation, you kind of have a different effect. You have a thought and a potential discussion about that thought. Why am I thinking this? Why am I worried about my test? Why am I, etc., etc.? And you're able to dissect it a little more because now you've stopped the general cycle of these thoughts, and it's going to probably start again, but at least because you've stopped the cycle, you're able to start slow and catch yourself and potentially even think further about those thoughts than you did before, because before you just accepted them and you moved on. But that's the problem with what's happening within these clashes now in the United States, is that people aren't thinking about their actions. They're not discussing, why did I do that? Why am I sitting? Why is my knee on this person's neck when he can barely breathe? He's already handcuffed. He's on the floor. There's five of us here. What am I afraid of? That's essentially the questions he should have asked himself. What makes me need to basically put my knee on this person's neck when there are people around that we can, if he gets up again, we'll just push him back down. If, right? That's the key situation. But under the case of him, and I don't know, it didn't seem like he was afraid. Most of the incidents that happened, there's some sort of fear that gets explained. But for him, he was just calmly sitting, like kneeling down with his knee in the person's neck. So there was no real fear. And that's how you can tell it's a little more cynical in certain cases. And in certain situations, it's not just fear that drives that action. Because if you shoot somebody through fear, it's an instant action. There's no coming back from it. But if you're, putting your knee on a person's neck for 3 minutes, that's not an instant action. You have time to think about your action. And fear is the jurisdiction of I'm doing something right now to save my life in the next 2 seconds. And
Right.
his action had no fear involved. It didn't seem like he had any fear involved. It almost seemed like he was above fear. He was all and mighty, like the opposite of humble. And those kind of
Mhm.
situations tend to lead another question. Well, you talk about the protests. There are peaceful protests, indeed, for sure, 100%. But then there's the riots that are happening. There are cases where the question has to be asked of, are these riots legit? Because you have people displaying a certain level of opinion, but you have to remember there's people against that opinion. There's people that do not share that same perspective. And those people,
Right.
they hide their identity so they can mask themselves and do chaos just to make the just to make the protest, just to make the protest seem like it's a negative thing. Like people can go in, fabricate issues, fabricate violence, and then of course the media is going to blame it on the protests. And of course
Right.
you always have rotten apples, people that just don't want to abide and they see a moment where they can exploit the weaknesses of society and then go in and do it. It doesn't have to be that they are associated with the protests. And the third one's more interesting. These are the questions that most people will never ask. The third one is actually that even though the main leading story in the media is a protest against specific issues against race, there is potentially a huge civilization or a huge civil wound based on the financial separation of the citizens. Why would people be running in and stealing stuff? There's an issue now, especially, and this happens in many poor countries, where the more crime increases, the higher the separation of the rich and the poor are. Now, the middle class is supposed to kind of glue that separation. The middle class is just an
Right.
ideal space where people comfortably live. The rich, of course, they have golden toilets, we know that. And then the poor can barely provide for themselves. But in the United States, in history, in the past few years, 20 years, 20, 30 years, there has been a decreasing of the middle class. That space where technically, because if you look at Brazil, it's a different place. So Brazil, in a general sense, it's either you're rich or either you're poor. That's the only thing. There's maybe middle class rich people, but there's no like middle. And the poor people literally live in cardboard boxes outside of the city. And in that case scenario,
Right.
there's high crime. And when you see crime like this, especially in a situation where, you know, we have market issues, we have economic market issues, we have diseases that aren't solved and have no promise of being solved. You have riots, or you have, um, why do I keep thinking patriot? Protests. You have protests happening in the streets. And then you have people that are still hurt by the economy from the history of things. And now they have a chance to get back what, the government took away from them. And
Yeah. So
yeah.
let me just say this quickly, right?
Hmm.
In my personal opinion, actually, fun fact: me and my parents, right, while we were driving down the road, we saw officers basically arresting this black guy, right?
Yeah.
And guess what?
Mm.
We were kind of joking about how this would be in the news, right?
Hmm.
Because this exactly looked like the George Floyd situation, right?
Mm.
There was this officer that had his knee pressed on this black man's neck,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
and it looked like an exact replica of the George Floyd situation,
Yeah,
right?
and it was in the
And
news, wasn't it?
yeah, I mean, like, I don't know why. Like, I'm not sure if that's like an actual way of like, sort of like, restraining someone, right?
I mean,
But
there's a level to it. Like you can still restrain someone like that to impair them, but not put your whole weight, onto the person so they stop breathing. Like if
oh
you
yeah, that's true. That's true.
you have
And
you have control over how much pressure you put on the person's neck, but you can still restrain them that way. But when the person is saying out loud that they can't breathe, release a little bit of your strength. Let them breathe.
that is true.
Mm.
And another issue I find now is that there are people out there, in America specifically, right, who want to defund the police.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty sure you know about this,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And like what I don't really get is that, obviously, every community is gonna have a couple of bad people, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like in the police community, right, there are going to be a few officers who are obviously racist, who are obviously doing the exact opposite of serving and protecting,
Okay.
right?
Socratic question.
Um,
Socratic question. What do you think it means to defund the police, the police department?
oh yeah, well, I think it means to defund.
Yeah, Socratic question. To really dig deep into your understanding of it. What does it mean to defund the police department?
Hmm. So like, obviously, to basically stop funding for the police, right? So basically stop giving them money, right?
There's
Essentially.
Okay, and it gets more detailed because it really depends on how that news is portrayed, and not all news portrays it in the correct way. So
Mm-hmm.
defunding doesn't mean breaking all of the funds. You have funding from states, you have funding from federal government, you have funding from different aspects, taxes from the social workers, etc. Now, the argument is that the word isn't accurate. They should
Right.
potentially say reallocate the police funds because when you look at what's happening with police in the general sense, what are police used for? Well, they're used for essentially violent situations. They're used and trained, not just used for, but they are trained to defend themselves and the people that are innocent using weapons. They're not trained to deal with homeless people. They're not trained to deal with drug addicts. They're not trained to deal with home issues between married people when they have some sort of issue. And they're not
Mm-hmm.
trained. What I'm getting at is all of these things are what they're called for. They're not just called for, hey, I'm getting robbed, please help. They're not just getting called for that. That makes up maybe 5 to 10% of the calls they get. But the other 90% is basic social interactions, which do not require a weapon of any sort. And what they're
Mm-hmm.
saying when they say defund is really what they're trying to say. And I don't know if they're saying it right or because the people that have stated that word, defunding, I don't know if they didn't think about what they meant, but their explanation is not to completely remove funding from the police, but to take some of the funding and allocate it into more social workers. For instance, homeless people, you give a little bit from the police uh, fund, and you create another section some way that takes care of homeless and tries to reestablish them back into society. They're saying that the police departments are getting paid too much, and their their work is beyond the resume of what a police officer should do. And because it's beyond the
Right.
resume, they don't do good on anything else other than what they were trained for, which most of the time is trained against bad guys, guns, weapons, safety, etc. Um, so when it comes to people that are, let's say, drug addicts or they do drugs in public, or they get caught with drugs or something like that, then you would transfer a police officer. They would get another section of this social worker, which other countries do. And there are houses that are specific for drug addicts that they let these drug addicts safely do whatever they want within those boundaries, but still provide a form for them to get out of that habit. So they will
Right.
try and medicate and find some ways to stop or help a person from going deep inside, but they will still provide like clean needles, for instance, instead of having to reuse dirty needles and getting infected in the arm and then dying on this tree. Those are the kind of funds that would help alleviate the work of the policeman. But what does a policeman do when he sees a person doing drugs? They put him in jail. They put him in the same jail that murderers go to. They put him in the same jail with all those other people that have done bad things. And when you put not very hostile people into a hostile environment, humans adapt. That non-hostile person is going to learn now to be hostile. So when he comes back in society, not only is he going to still probably do drugs, but he's going to do some extra stuff to get around, to get those drugs, to sell those drugs, to fight back if he gets caught with the drugs, because he is within the environment of hostility. But that person was just a basic drug user. And then he gets pushed into jail with all of the murderers, and the way that they treat their people. Obviously, prison's not the best place to be, but that individual inherits certain animalistic senses that he sees in his environment, especially if he's there for like 5 to 10 years, which is normally how long it takes for a person to be in jail after caught with drugs. So an individual that gets within those boundaries is now unfixable. He is now a criminal when he reaches the jail or after he leaves the jail. He becomes more criminal than when he was before jail. And that's kind of the opposite of what you want the police to do, what jails should do. Jails should re-inhabitate people, be away from a criminal rather than put them back into an environment of criminals and then release a new criminal that just inherited all of those traits of the people around him. So
So yeah, when you kind of send like a criminal to like a prison, it's not like a hit or miss, right? Because essentially, yeah, there's a chance that obviously the criminal will learn this lesson and he won't want to come back there, right?
mhm.
So then he will make an effort to change. But then there is also another chance that he won't learn anything, and in fact, he'll come out as a worse person than he was before, right?
I mean, there's a
And then
chance
he's
that he
probably
will
going to
play.
commit even worse crimes, right?
Yeah,
That's the idea.
there's a chance he's just going to do what he needs to do to get the 5 years out of the way. And hell, who knows who else is
Mhm.
in there? Um, that's a good place for criminals to network, to be honest.
Right.
You know, it's for criminals to understand and communicate with, because that's just human nature. We don't take an environment for granted. If we're in an environment with like people, we're gonna network with them, and some case scenarios probably meet up with them after the situation, after the jail sentence, if a person's not in there for life. But that's kind of also the issue here is you have a chance to rehabilitate. Ugh. You have a chance to fix someone in a jail, but you also have a chance of doing the opposite. It really depends on the jail. It really depends on the people in the jail, how the jail works, what services inside the jail can provide a person to help them recover from the criminal lifestyle. But in the end, before we even bring this person who does drugs into a jail full of murderers, we should consider the fact that he's not like them. He's an individual that's sick and needs treatment in a different form. Just because the drug itself is illegal doesn't make that person a criminal for using it. Just because you have prescription drugs over the counter, people get addicted to medical drugs, doesn't make them a criminal for you abusing their drugs. So why does it make a person that gets illegal drugs a criminal? What he's doing is, he has a sickness and he's appeasing it, because we understand already that drugs in a general form, they tend to manipulate the mind into you wanting something specifically. It's an addiction form. So an addiction in essence is a disease. You have addiction to gambling, we've talked about this too, and those are all forms of disease that can push a person to an unhealthy level. And when it gets to an unhealthy level, the question is, it's not a criminal level, it's an unhealthy level. It's a medical condition. It needs to be treated a specific way. And police are not trained to treat that. They're not trained for a lot of things. But that's what they're saying, is to defund the police, because this one institution that's supposed to take care of all of those details technically isn't doing that correctly. I mean, they're responsible for them. Sure, they're being paid to do it. Cool. But their training isn't specific, because you cannot talk with a drug addict with a gun. You have to be able to talk with them in a different way so that they're not running away from you. They're coming to you and seeking help. But who's going to seek help from someone pointing a gun at them? You know what I mean? So what they're saying is that the police department is an unmatch, is not a match for certain tasks that they are given responsibility for. So cut the funds that they receive and create new institutions that focus on those specific things, that focus on helping people off the drugs from off the streets from drugs, from homelessness, from domestic abuse, all these kind of pieces that most people get end up calling the police for. And their argument is, hey, when I fall and break my leg, that's an emergency. I call 911. That's the United States number. And if I do that, I'm not going to ask for a police officer, right? Can you hear me? Oh,